The drug that turned Victorian women into mad women was not a sensational legend, but a reality that happened right in the houses of the wealthy. Doctors prescribed it, husbands encouraged it, and bottles of laudanum were kept by the teapot, becoming the secret to keeping women quiet and manageable. The so-called cure was actually a poison, turning ladies into shadows even when they were still conscious. Tonight you will witness how a so-called miracle drug turned grace into delirium and why so many Victorian women never woke from their long sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the quiet bedroom of a Victorian woman, among the perfume bottles and powders there would be another small glass container gleaming with equal charm. It was filled with laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, but it was packaged as an accessory of beauty. The labels were soft pastel colors, the lettering picked out in gold. These bottles shone in the lamplight, delicate and refined, sitting comfortably beside a bottle of lavender water. No one questioned that they carried something dangerous. They were admired, and in being admired they were trusted. This trust was built on appearances alone. It is almost absurd to imagine that something so harmful was praised simply for having a shiny label. Yet that was precisely the case. This illusion was reinforced by the medical establishment. Doctors in Victorian London prescribed laudanum with an ease that now feels unsettling. Women came to them with any number of complaints: menstrual pain, headaches, restless nights, or feelings of melancholy, and the solution was always the same. A bottle of the dark liquid was placed into their hands, a universal cure. The medical belief of the time was that women were inherently fragile, their bodies governed by a mysterious instability originating from the womb. This condition, vaguely termed hysteria, could explain almost any behavior that did not conform to social expectation. A woman who cried too much was hysterical. A woman who resisted her husband was hysterical. The cure was simple: administer the liquid, allow the body to grow heavy, and wait for the silence. The trust between patient and doctor was immense. Women accepted the small bottles because they were told it was proper, modern, and safe. Husbands encouraged it. Mothers passed the habit to daughters. Pharmacies sold them cheaply, and soon nearly every household had a bottle at the ready. It became an ordinary necessity, as common as bread or soap. To refuse laudanum was almost unthinkable. A woman who questioned her doctor risked being called difficult, a label that carried significant weight. If we compare this to today, it would be like visiting a clinic and finding that every patient, regardless of their complaint, was sent home with the same strong sedative, and refusing it would mean being branded as unreasonable. The lack of alternatives left few options. The ritual of dosing became a daily routine, and the repetition blurred the line between treatment and habit. The consulting rooms where these decisions were made gave an impression of knowledge, yet the diagnoses were vague. The cure was always waiting behind the desk. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how many women were silenced in this way, their true needs dismissed in favor of an easy solution that left them weaker each day. The spread of laudanum through medical authority was the foundation of the crisis. Once the doctor's bottle entered the home, its presence carried the weight of legitimacy, and its use was reinforced by every figure of authority around a woman. The epidemic was not hidden, it was endorsed, repeated, and normalized. A quiet force that dictated not only nights, but the entire rhythm of existence. Under Victorian eyes, the ideal woman was a figure of composure and quiet endurance. She managed her home, supervised servants, and maintained an appearance of flawless order. Beneath that serene surface, however, was a secret sustained by the small glass bottle of laudanum. It became the quiet companion of countless wives who smiled through their duties while their bodies weakened in silence. The daily rhythm of a wife's life offered little space for complaint. When exhaustion deepened into sleeplessness, or when nerves grew raw, the bottle promised a heavy, drugged stillness that made the next day bearable. The promise of unconsciousness became irresistible. It is hard not to smirk at how society applauded these women for being so calm and composed when in reality they were often drugged into silence. Even within families, the bottle's presence was accepted. Husbands saw their wives performing tasks and judged them steady. Children saw their mothers smiling faintly and learned that such quiet smiles were normal. The reality was that many of those smiles masked a numbness produced by laudanum. Every layer of emotion was dulled until only a muted version of life remained. The mother was present in body, but absent in spirit. In the parlors and bedrooms, a strange idea took root, that endless sleep was a mark of refinement. Women who drifted for 16 hours a day were praised as delicate and sensitive, their prolonged drowsiness seen as proof of a tender spirit. Beds became the stage where this illusion played out. Curtains were drawn, lamps dimmed, and the sleeper lay motionless under layers of linen. Visitors lowered their voices, convinced they were in the presence of a soul attuned to higher sensibility. The truth was that the body, weighed down by repeated doses, could not fully wake. Families interpreted this as serenity. Doctors reinforced the idea, suggesting that the more a woman slept, the more her nervous system was soothed. This distorted ideal played out nightly at the dinner table. In many homes, the evening meal was an exercise in silence. The mother, having already taken her dose, would preside over the table with slow eyelids and an unfocused gaze. Words would leave her lips in fragments. Children learned to look at their plates and chew in quiet compliance. The bottle sat discreetly on a sideboard, ready to season the mood should tension rise. I find it deeply sad to picture those children watching their mother's slow blinks, waiting for recognition that never came and learning to accept silence as the shape of home. The effects of constant dosing became apparent in subtle ways. A wife's movements grew slower, her words softer, her laughter rarer. To those around her, these changes seemed natural. After all, women were expected to be gentle and restrained. The symptoms of sedation were mistaken for virtues of femininity. The medicine not only controlled the body, but also reinforced the cultural ideal of what a woman should be. Calmness was praised, detachment mistaken for refinement, weakness rebranded as grace. The smile of the Victorian wife, faint and composed, became one of the most deceptive masks of the age. For 2 decades, one woman in Victorian London seemed to embody this ideal perfectly. She managed her home without complaint, never raised her voice, and kept her household in perfect order. Neighbors admired her calm, friends praised her patience, and her family believed she was the very model of a devoted wife and mother. To anyone looking from the outside, her life appeared untroubled. Her death came quietly, recorded as the result of a weak heart. Family and neighbors gathered, spoke softly of her virtues, and remembered the years in which she had never faltered. To them, she was a woman who had lived with discipline and ended with dignity. The truth of her life was uncovered only after she was gone. When her belongings were sorted, her children discovered beneath her bed a hidden collection of more than 200 empty bottles. Each bore the faint traces of laudanum. The discovery shocked those closest to her. How could a woman so admired for steadiness have depended so heavily on the opium tincture? The answer lay in the role demanded of her. To be praised as a model of calm was to be expected never to complain. Every day she carried burdens without protest, and every night she turned to the bottle to silence the toll it took. It is almost bitterly funny to think that a woman could win such admiration simply because she was drugged enough not to cause trouble. Her children recalled her faint smiles and steady hands, But only in hindsight did these memories shift. The calm that seemed natural was revealed to have been chemically maintained. The very qualities for which she was honored were sustained by laudanum. The record of her death, weak heart, reflected how little was acknowledged. The physical effects of opium use were masked under vague terms, preserving the illusion of dignity even as the bottles told another story. I find it chilling to imagine her children kneeling by her bed, pulling bottle after bottle into the light, realizing that the mother they knew had never truly been awake. Her case illustrates how addiction could coexist with the highest social praise. Society rewarded the outcome without caring about the means. The epidemic thrived because it aligned so neatly with cultural ideals. The discovery of 200 bottles under one bed was striking, but it was only one household's truth among thousands. What had seemed an individual weakness was revealed as a social pattern woven into the fabric of everyday life. The model wife, admired for 20 years, became in death the proof of a larger crisis. Her hidden bottles showed that composure could be bought, but only at great cost. The habit of laudanum use passed quietly from mother to daughter. It began in small ways, when a child was asked to fetch the bottle, or measure a few drops into a spoon. By the age of 9, some girls could handle the task as part of their domestic duties, as ordinary as stirring sugar into tea. The smell of laudanum became familiar early, its sharp, sweet odor signaling not danger but the comfort of their mothers resting. The lesson was learned through the rhythm of daily life. A daughter who helped her mother dose at night grew accustomed to the idea that this was what women did when tired. When her own life later brought strain, she already knew the solution. The most chilling part is how young children, eager to help, became the guardians of a ritual that would eventually consume them. Mothers sometimes offered a drop to soothe the child's nerves, believing it harmless because they had been given it the same way. This deepened the cycle, turning children into patients before they could understand. The story of one 13-year-old girl is particularly striking. Her mother, concerned by signs of nervousness and persuaded by medical talk of hysteria, began giving her regular doses. The girl learned that by claiming discomfort, she would be rewarded with attention. It is almost grimly absurd that love and comfort were delivered through drops of opium rather than through words or care. The change in her body came quickly. Sleep became impossible without the nightly dose. She grew pale, her energy flagging, yet her mother saw only that she was quiet and no longer difficult. The behavior that society feared was absent, replaced by a drugged stillness. The girl's future was shaped by reliance before it had even begun. Her story was not isolated. Many households turned to the bottle as a quick answer to childhood restlessness, believing early treatment would mold girls into calmer women. The epidemic was not just social but familial, ingrained in the most intimate relationship. It was a quiet inheritance, passed down not through words, but through imitation and the shared atmosphere of a drugged home. Among the many contradictions of the Victorian age, few were as stark as the double standards surrounding opium use. Doctors themselves were far from immune, some sipping laudanum throughout the day or injecting morphine into their own veins. These men, respected in their communities, carried on their work without condemnation. Yet when women were found to rely on the same drugs, the judgment was entirely different. A woman dependent on laudanum was accused of weakness, of moral failure, of slipping into vice. It is almost laughable in its hypocrisy that men in white coats could inject themselves daily, while the women they treated were damned as fallen if they swallowed the same liquid. This disparity determined not only reputation but also fate. For a man, dependence might mean whispers, but rarely public disgrace. For a woman, discovery could mean confinement. Families, anxious to protect their name, often sent female relatives to asylums or rest homes. The justification was that they were unstable, unfit to manage themselves.
What society refused to see was that their condition mirrored that of men who continued to walk freely. The asylums became filled with women whose only crime was reliance on a drug they had been encouraged to take. Inside they were treated not as patients, but as moral offenders. The institutions known as rest homes were often described as places of care, but in truth they became prisons of silence. The treatment most often prescribed was more morphine, injected each morning by nurses who followed orders without question. Women who entered hoping for peace found themselves reduced to shadows, dulled by the steady flow of opiates. The quiet that followed was praised as an improvement. Families were assured their wives or daughters were calm. It is grimly ironic that the measure of success in these institutions was not true healing but the degree to which women stopped speaking or resisting. The halls were lined with closed doors, behind which women lay in beds or sat in chairs, their eyes glazed. I find it unsettling to imagine how many women disappeared into these homes, remembered by families as calm, when in truth they had been drugged into absence. The story of doctors addicted to their own prescriptions while condemning their patients reveals the structures of power that shaped Victorian life. Those who held authority
indulge without consequence. Those without authority, particularly women, carried the blame. The epidemic was thus not only medical but social, a reflection of inequality dressed up as morality. The quiet routines of Victorian life were punctuated by moments when the private horror of addictions spilled into public view. Police records from the era reveal unsettling scenes of women found wandering the streets in the middle of the night, sometimes barefoot or half-dressed, their faces vacant. When questioned, many could not remember their own names. For those who encountered them, the assumption was madness. In reality, these women were deep in the grip of laudanum dependence, their minds unraveling. The law offered little understanding. Police categorized them as lunatics or vagrants and locked them in holding cells. Families, desperate to preserve their reputations, seldom corrected the assumption, preferring to allow neighbors to believe in insanity rather than admit to dependency. Other tragedies were more final. Marriage was meant to symbolize stability, but for some brides it became a death sentence. A young woman nervous about her wedding night would be given laudanum to calm her fears. The advice came from mothers, doctors, and even husbands. The logic seemed sound. A calm bride was a cooperative bride, but with no understanding of dosage. The line between reassurance and a fatal mistake was thin. In one well-documented case, a bride was given laudanum to help her rest. She drank the dose and lay down in her new home. She never woke up. The official explanation was vague: weakness of the heart or sudden collapse. The shame of admitting a wedding had ended in a funeral was too great. The family buried not only their daughter but also the truth. I find it haunting to imagine a bride laid out in her wedding gown, her family forced to arrange a burial instead of a celebration. The most unsettling part is not only the loss of her life but the silence that followed, as if her death was an embarrassment rather than a warning. These tragedies were not rare. They were part of a larger pattern where the drug infiltrated every stage of a woman's life, from adolescence to motherhood, from sickness to marriage. What should have been milestones of joy were overshadowed by dependence and danger. The youngest victims of the epidemic were often the most silent. Childbirth in the Victorian age was followed by an immediate return to duty. Mothers, exhausted and in pain, were prescribed laudanum to help them sleep. What they didn't know was that the drug also flowed into their breast milk, reaching the child who depended on them for nourishment. Infants exposed in this way slept for long hours and rarely fussed. Mothers welcomed this, believing their babies were easy. Only later did the problems emerge. The children grew sluggish, refused to feed properly, and appeared weaker than others. Families called them delicate, never suspecting the truth. It is almost absurd that what was praised as a calm, manageable infant was in truth a child sedated by a powerful narcotic. The cycle deepened as doctors encouraged continued use. If a mother complained of fatigue, she was prescribed a larger dose. Each adjustment meant the milk carried even more of the drug. The mother, in her desire to follow advice, unwittingly became the agent of harm. This quiet poisoning extended beyond nursing. Manufacturers began to package opiates in a form designed to attract children directly. Candy, laudanum, morphine, and opium were disguised in sweets, lozenges, and syrups wrapped in bright paper. They were marketed as harmless treats that soothed sore throats or quieted restless tempers. Parents saw advertisements claiming safety and purity with no mention of danger. It is almost laughable to think of narcotics being sold as children's candy. Yet this was not unusual. Children who had grown up watching their mothers dose themselves now had their own pathway into dependence, handed over in the guise of indulgence. The silence surrounding these products ensured their success, and a new generation was introduced to the same haze that had clouded the lives of their mothers. The cumulative effect of this widespread use was an epidemic of quiet suffering, yet the silence could not hold forever. When the drug was withheld, the calm it created often gave way to chaos. In some cases, withdrawal led to terrifying hallucinations and violent ends. One story tells of a young woman who, after days without her dose, began to see shadows moving in the corners of her room. Her terror escalated until she became convinced a rat was crawling inside her head. In a frenzy, she clawed at her hair, smashed a mirror, and finally, grabbing a candle, pressed it to her dress. She believed that only through burning could she free herself from the torment in her mind. Her death was not recorded as a result of withdrawal. It was described as an uncontrollable act of female weakness. Another case of hysteria. The physical toll of long-term dependence also left its mark. One of the clearest signs appeared on the wrists of women who had used laudanum for years. The daily act of holding the bottle and uncorking it left the skin roughened, forming calluses. It was a mark not of labor, but of the endless act of lifting poison to the lip. As dependence deepened and hands began to shake, some women tied ribbons or cords around the bottle, fastening it to their wrists so it would not fall. The bottle became a permanent companion, dangling like a bracelet of destruction. The final resting places of these women tell their story more clearly than any polite words. In churchyards across London there are graves with no names, no markers. These are the burial places of women whose lives were undone by laudanum. When they died, their families chose silence over remembrance. To carve a name on stone was to invite questions, to expose the shame of a woman who had lost herself to dependence. It is grimly ironic that the same society that celebrated women as the moral anchors of the home erased them the moment their lives no longer fit the image. A blank grave was easier to explain than a headstone tied to scandal. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine these graveyards dotted with patches of unmarked earth. The cruelest part is not only that the women died without recognition, but that their erasure was chosen by those closest to them. Silence was considered protection when in reality it was abandonment. These unmarked graves stand as silent indictments. The absence of names speaks louder than any inscription, reminding us that what was hidden was not only the bodies of women, but the truth of what destroyed them. For decades, the history of Victorian women has been written in a way that hides the truth. Words like hysteria, weakness, and instability were used again and again as though they explained everything. When wives or daughters sank into silence, when they wandered streets in delirium, when they were buried in unmarked graves, society labeled them as fragile or diseased. But if we look carefully at what surrounded them, the bottles on shelves, the prescriptions repeated without question, the advertisements promising safety, another picture becomes clear. These women were not mad. They were slowly poisoned from the moment they first swallowed what they believed was medicine. Families mistook the silence for improvement. They thought fragility meant refinement, that obedience meant health. In reality, what they celebrated was the erasure of vitality. Doctors reinforced the illusion, claiming women were naturally unstable and that hysteria needed to be subdued. Laudanum was their universal answer. What no one admitted was that the same medicine was undoing the very women it was meant to protect. The cruelest part is that women were blamed for the very symptoms created by the medicine they were told to trust. By the end of the century, the truth began to emerge. Medical journals cautiously acknowledged the risks. Laws were passed to restrict sales, but recognition came too late. Generations of women had already been lost. Their names were whispered less and less until they were forgotten altogether. The reforms that came were written over their silence, their graves, and their erasure. These women deserve to be remembered not as hysterics, but as victims of a system that betrayed them. Their obedience was not weakness. Their trust was not folly. They followed the instructions given to them by doctors, by families, by society. They swallowed the drops that were prescribed as medicine, and in return they lost their health, their strength, and their very selves. Their decline was not a natural part of femininity. It was not evidence of unstable minds. It was the outcome of poisoning disguised as care. Each bottle of laudanum represented both comfort and destruction, offered as progress while delivering decay. To remember them properly is to acknowledge that they were not insane but undone by a culture of denial, obedience, and silence. Their stories, scattered through diaries, police records, and unmarked graves, form a hidden history of women who were erased twice, once in life by sedation, and again in death by the refusal to name them. The women of Victorian society did not go mad on their own. They were poisoned day by day, until their voices were silenced. Their obedience to medical advice became the pathway to their erasure. Their deaths were not inevitable. They were preventable. The blame lies not with them, but with the bottles that stood on every shelf and with the culture that insisted those bottles were safe. They did not lose themselves by nature. They were lost because they were given poison disguised as care, and told to take it faithfully. They did not go mad. They were poisoned while still conscious, and those long sleeps lasted forever. Now, as this story draws to a close, I want to leave you not with despair, but with calm. You have followed a history filled with shadows, but the telling of it lifts those shadows into the open. The bottles have shattered. The silence has been named, and the voices once erased are finally heard. Let that bring you not only understanding but also rest. So close your eyes and let the weight of history settle gently, not as a burden but as a reminder that truth can be found even in the quietest places. The story is complete. The echoes have been heard, and the night can now be peaceful. Good night. Sleep well. May the silence that once hid suffering now bring you only rest.